On behalf of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, I welcome you to this second lecture by Nobel laureate Dr. Amartya Sen, our Pardee visiting professor for the academic year 2001-2002. The third and fourth lectures he will deliver in the early part of the spring semester, and lectures 5 and 6 in the latter part of the spring semester. In answer to a question that a number of you have put to me, yes, it is intended that these lectures will appear in published form. Tonight, Dr. Sen, as he did last night, will speak for perhaps an hour, and then we'll take questions. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Sen.
Today's lecture is entitled, as you probably know, Globalization and Solidarity. The world in which we live is both remarkably rich and astonishingly impoverished. There is unprecedented prosperity in the world. The massive command over resources, knowledge, and technology that we now take for granted would be hard for our ancestors even to imagine. But ours is also a world of extraordinary deprivation and of staggering inequality. An astounding number of children are ill-nourished and illiterate, as well as ill-cared and needlessly ill. Millions perish every week from diseases that can be completely eliminated, or at least prevented from killing people with abandon. The world seems to be firmly divided into regions of manifest prosperity and those of great penury. That's another feature of it. And also between the great beneficiaries from the progress of science and technology and those who get extremely little from that progress. The severity of the global divide does not inspire great confidence in the power of global solidarity. If we are really so close, then how come we are so distant? This skepticism is well reflected in a particular form in the rhetoric of the so-called anti-globalization protesters. Based on the thesis that global relations are primarily antagonistic and adversarial, rather than mutually supportive, it is natural to ask for reduced globalization, indeed the anti-globalization, in the interest of the underdogs of the world. In that perspective, being pro-poor goes very well with being anti-globalization. But is this really a good reading, a sufficiently probing assessment of the nature of globalization and its implications? I would suggest that it's not, and that there is a serious misdiagnosis here. But it is also extremely important to be clear why this is a misdiagnosis, precisely what is wrong with it. The rejection of the anti-globalization rhetoric need not, and indeed does not, establish the wisdom of a no-nonsense pro-globalization position either. For one thing, we need to scrutinize not only the nature and demands of globalization seen as an isolated phenomenon, but also the characteristics and consequences of institutional features and practical arrangements that have tended to accompany the expansion of global relations. Indeed, I shall argue that the analyses presented by both anti-globalization warriors and pro-globalization proponents need substantial scrutiny and emendation on the basis of a wider appraisal of globalization and its associative features. How does the question of identity, with which this series of lectures is concerned, come into all this? It comes in naturally enough, I would argue. Indeed, group loyalties, and affiliative relations are central to the economic, political, scientific, cultural, and ethical features associated with the expansion of global relations and cross-border encounters that characterize globalization. Also, just as business relation creates communities of its own, so does scientific interactions, cultural attachments, and other interpersonal interconnections. In this lecture, I want to examine first some historical features of increasing global relations, then examine the economic implications of global arrangements, particularly in the contemporary world. The demand for justice, then the anti-globalization protesters' voice involve, of course, global ethics. I shall go on to those ethical issues only in the fifth lecture, I'm afraid, in this series, which will be given in April, because I have to do things one by one. But they also involve a certain reading of history. That is the rhetoric and the arguments and the approach of anti-globalization protests. They also involve a certain reading of history and, of course, a particular understanding of economics. I will try to discuss both in this lecture. Globalization is often seen as an expression of westernization of the global economy. Indeed, those who take an upbeat view of the phenomenon see it as a contribution of Western civilization to the world. In fact, there is a nicely stylized history that goes with this straightforward reading. It all happened in Europe. First came the Renaissance, then the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And this led to a massive increase in living standards in the West. And now, those great achievements of the West are spreading to the world. Globalization, in this view, is not only good, it's also a gift of the West to the world. The champions of this reading of history tend to feel upset not only by the way this great benefaction is seen mistakenly as a curse, but also the way the West's bestowal to the world is undervalued and castigated by an ungrateful world, rest of the world. Like all good stylized stories, this one too has some truth in it. But there is a good deal of fantasy as well, on which more presently. There's another, in some ways an opposite story, which also receives attention. This sees Western dominance as the devil of the piece. In this view, contemporary capitalism, driven and led by greedy and grabby Western entrepreneurs and businessmen in Europe and North America, have established rules of trade and business relations that do not serve the interests of the poorer people in the world. In making criticism of globalization, its narrowly Western character is often given a prominent role, and sometimes globalization is seen as a correlate of Western dominance, indeed a continuation of Western imperialism. While different parts of the anti-globalization movement have different concerns and priorities, the resentment of Western dominance certainly plays a very significant part in many of these protests. There's clearly an anti-Western element in many parts of the anti-globalization movement, and the celebration of non-Western identities of various types related to religion, such as Islamic fundamentalism, or region, such as Asian values, or culture, such as Confucian ethics, can add fuel to the fire of anti-Western sentiment. But is globalization really a new Western curse? I shall argue that it's not a new Western curse. Indeed, it is in general neither new, nor necessarily Western, nor indeed a curse. Indeed, globalization has, over thousands of years, contributed to the progress of the world. through travel, trade, migration, spread of cultural influences, and dissemination of science, knowledge, and understanding, including that of advancement of technology. These global interrelations have often been very productive in the advancement of different countries in the world. And the active agents of globalization have often been located very far from the West. To illustrate, let me look back at the beginning of the last millennium rather than the beginning of the present one, where we are. Around 1000 AD, global spread of science, technology, and mathematics was changing the nature of the old world. But the dissemination then was, to a great extent, in the opposite direction to what we see today. For example, the high technology in the world of 1000 AD included paper and printing, the crossbow and gunpowder, the clock and the iron chain suspension bridge, the kite and the magnetic compass, the wheelbarrow and the rotary fan. Each one of these examples of high technology of the world a millennium ago was well established and extensively used in China and was practically unknown anywhere else. Globalization spread them across the world, including to Europe. A similar movement occurred in the Eastern influence on Western mathematics. The decimal system emerged and became well developed in India between the 2nd and the 6th century, and was used extensively also by Arab mathematicians soon thereafter. These mathematical innovations reached Europe mainly in the last quarter of the 10th century and began having its major impact in the early years of the last millennium, playing a significant part in the scientific revolution that helped to transform Europe. Insofar as anything can be said about the identity of the agents of globalization, that identity in this case is neither exclusively Western nor European, nor indeed linked to Western dominance. Indeed, Europe would have been a lot poorer economically, culturally, and scientifically had it resisted the globalization of mathematics, of science, of technology at that time. And the same applies, though in the reverse direction from west to east today. To reject globalization of science and technology on the ground that this is Western influence and imperialism would not only amount to overlooking global contributions drawn from many different parts of the world that lie solidly behind so-called Western science and technology, but would also be quite a daft practical decision, given the extent to which the whole world stands to benefit from the process. To equate this phenomenon with Western imperialism of ideas and beliefs, as the rhetoric often suggests, would be a very serious and costly error, in the same way that any European resistance to Eastern influence would have been at the beginning of the last millennium. We must not, of course, overlook the fact that there are issues related to globalization that do connect with imperialism, actual imperialism as it existed. The history of conquest, colonialism, and alien rule over Africa and Asia remain relevant today in many different ways. But it would be a great mistake to see globalization primarily as a feature of imperialism. It's much bigger, much greater than that. Indeed, in resisting the diagnosis of globalization as a phenomenon of quintessential Western origin, we have to be critical not only of anti-Western rhetoric, but also of pro-Western chauvinism that one can find in many contemporary writings. Certainly, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolutions were great achievements. And indeed, much of the action there occurred in Europe and later, of course, in America. And yet, many of these developments drew on the experience of the rest of the world, rather than being entirely segmented and confined within the boundaries of the discrete Western civilization. Indeed, our global civilization is a world heritage, not just a collection of disparate local cultures. Just to give an example, when a modern mathematician sitting in Boston invokes an algorithm to solve a difficult computational problem, she may not be aware that she is helping to commemorate the name of the Arab mathematician Al-Khwarizmi. Algorithm, the word derives from Al-Khwarizmi, who flourished in the first half of the 9th century and worked most of his life close to Baghdad. There's a chain of intellectual relations that link Western mathematics and science to a collection of distinctly non-Western practitioners, of whom Al-Khwarizmi, more fully Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, was one. In fact, the term algebra is also derived from his famous book, Al-Jar wal Muqabila. Indeed, Al-Khwarizmi is one of a very large group of contributors from different non-Western societies, Arab, Chinese, Indian, and others, whose works influenced European Renaissance and later the Age of Enlightenment, and ultimately even the Industrial Revolution. West, of course, must get full credit for the remarkable achievement that occurred in Europe and Europeanized America. But the idea of an immaculate Western conception is an ahistorical fantasy. Not only is the progress of global science and technology not an exclusively West-led phenomenon, there were major global developments in the world in which the West was not at all involved, not even as a recipient initially anyway. The idea that the West, even if not the exclusive originator of global progress, has been invariably a major player in every global game must also be strongly resisted. As an illustration, consider the important event, very important event in world history, of the printing of the first book in the world. It was a marvelously globalized event. The technology of printing was, of course, entirely the achievement of the Chinese, as I mentioned already. But what about the content of what was printed? In fact, the first printed book was a Sanskrit treatise in Buddhist philosophy, Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita Sutra, sometimes referred to as the Diamond Sutra, translated into Chinese from Sanskrit in very early 5th century. It was printed 4 centuries later in 868 AD. The translator of this Sanskrit sutra, Kumarajiva, was half Turkish and half Indian and lived in a part of eastern Turkestan called Kutch, but later migrated to China. All this, involving China, involving Turkey, involving India, is globalization all right. But the West is not at all in sight. In fact, the misdiagnosis that globalization of ideas and practices have to be resisted because they entail westernization, dreaded westernization, has played a very regressive part already in the colonial and post-colonial world, including in the post-colonial literature. It incites parochial tendencies and also undermines the possibility of objectivity in science and knowledge. Indeed, it is not only counterproductive in itself, it can also end up, given the global interaction throughout history, as a good way for non-Western societies to shoot themselves in the foot, even in their precious cultural foot. Consider the resistance in India to the use of Western ideas and concepts in science and mathematics. In the 19th century, the debate between Orientalists and Westernizers in India fitted into the broad controversy about focusing either on Western education or on indigenous Indian education, seen as a dichotomy that the British Raj had to choose between. The Westernizers, quote unquote, such as the redoubtable Macaulay, saw no merit whatsoever in the native Indian tradition. As he explained, I quote from Macaulay, "I've never found one among them, advocates of Indian tradition, who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia," unquote. Written, I might say, in Trinity College, of which he was a member. Partly in retaliation, the advocates of native education resisted Western imports altogether. Both sides, however, agreed on something. They accepted the foundational dichotomy. But given the deep interrelations between culture and civilizations across the world, this was bound to produce some very awkward classificatory problems. Let me illustrate with one. The illustration is provided by the arrival in India of the trigonometric term sine, like sine, cosine, tan, and so on, directly from Western trigonometry. It came straight from the British, and while seeing it as a yet another example of Anglo-Saxon excursion into an undermining of Indian culture, the genesis of the term was not in fact traced to its Indian origin, which in fact it does have. The migration of the concept and terminology is also a very interesting step-by-step thing to follow to understand how globalization of science and ideas occur. The 5th century Indian mathematician Aryabhat, to whom I'll come back in the next lecture, in the third lecture, including Arab commentary on his writing, which is also a feature of globalization. The 5th century Indian mathematician Aryabhat had discussed the concept of sine in the 5th century, in his contemporary writings, and he called it Jya Ardha. Jya is chord, Ardha is half. From there, the term moved on in an interesting migratory way. And I quote from Howard Eves' History of Mathematics to describe its geographical movement. So I'm quoting now Howard Eves. Aryabhat called it Ardha Jya, half chord, or Jya Ardha, chord half, and then abbreviated the term by simply using Jya, chord. From Jya, the Arabs phonetically derived Jiba, which followed Arabic practice of, and following Arabic practice of omitting vowels, it was written with the consonants only, JB. Now, Jiba, aside from its technical significance, is a completely meaningless word in Arabic. Later writers who came across JB as an abbreviation for the meaningless word Jiba substituted Jabe instead with the same consonant, JB. So they called it Jabe, which contains the same letters and is a good Arabic word meaning cove or bay. Still later, Girardet of Cremona in 1150, when he made his translation from the Arabic, replaced the Arabian Jabe by its Latin equivalent, sinus, meaning a cove or a bay, from whence comes our present word sine, unquote. Given the cultural and intellectual interconnection, the question of what is Western and what is not is often very hard to decide. Both Macaulay and his Indianist opponents may have to shuffle their shelves quite a bit to come to terms with the world's globalized history. The polar opposite of globalization would be persistent separatism and relentless autarky. It is interesting here to recollect an image of seclusion that has been invoked with much anxiety in many Sanskrit texts, beginning from about 2,500 years ago, that is about 500 BC. It's quite amazing how often this has been repeated. I know of 4 uses, which I'm going to mention, but there may be more. This is the story, quite a fetching story, I think, of a well frog the Koopa Manduka, who lives its whole life within one well and is suspicious. I know those only inside things inside the well and nothing else, and is very suspicious of everything outside it. As in fact, Ganapathy explains, the frog has a world view, but it's a world confined to the well. So beginning from about 500 BC, there are at least 4 Sanskrit texts that I know, and there may be more: Ganapathy, Hitopadesh, Prasanna Raghava, Bhattikavya, that warn us not to be well frogs. The well frog does, of course, have, as I mentioned, this perspective, but that perspective is confined to that little well. The scientific, cultural, and economic history of the world would have been very limited had we lived like well frogs. We certainly need to resist the well frogs, and I might add the attorneys of well frogs, who are often very eloquent. It may be argued, however, that in this lecture, so far I'm concentrating far too much on the globalization of science and literature, and not enough, indeed, so far not at all, about the globalization of economic relations, particularly the problem created by the modern global economy. What about them? It could be said, all right, the point you're trying to make about science and literature and culture may well be right, or may or may not be, but that's not what we are concerned with. Not quite true, because people are concerned quite a lot of the rebellion of the Western ideas, especially in a variety of literature, varying from local communitarian literature, post-colonial literature, as well as religious or fundamentalist literature, actually targets not just the economy, but in fact the concepts, the ideas, the ways of thinking, and science and literature generally. But what about economics? Let me begin here by noting that the importance of global contact and interaction applies to economic relation in much the same way, and the penalty of being a well frog is no less there. This can be brought out by the history of trade and commercial contacts. But let me concentrate not on the history, which I could also do, because that's also a very long history, and in the printed version of the book I'll go more into it. But what about the modern global relations, on which many people tend to concentrate? There is much evidence here too that the global economy has brought prosperity to many different areas on the globe. Pervasive poverty, nasty, brutish, and short lives dominated the world a few centuries ago, with only a few pockets of rare affluence. In overcoming that penury, extensive economic interrelations, as well as modern technology, have been very influential, and they continue to remain extremely important today. What has happened in Europe and America and Japan and East Asia has important messages for all other regions in the world. And we cannot go very far into understanding the nature of the global economic problems today without first acknowledging the positive fruits of global economic contacts and its massive promise. Indeed, the economic predicament of the poor across the world cannot be reversed, I would argue, by withholding from them the great advantages of contemporary technology, the well-established efficiency of international trade and exchange, and the social as well as economic merits of living in open rather than closed societies. Rather, the main issue is how to make good use of the remarkable benefits of economic intercourse and technological progress in a way that pays adequate attention to the interests of the deprived and the underdog. That is, I would argue, the constructive question that emerges from the anti-globalization movement. It is an important question, but constitutively it's not a question about globalization at all. And the linkage with globalization is only instrumental and contingent. What then is the main point of contention? The principal challenge, I would submit, relates in one way or another to inequality, international as well as intranational inequality. The inequalities that irk concern disparities in affluence and also gross asymmetries in political, social, and economic opportunities and power. The issue of inequality relates centrally to disputes about globalization. A crucial question concerns the sharing of the potential gains from globalization between rich and poor countries and between different groups within a country. It is not adequate to understand that the poor of the world need globalization as much as the rich do. It is also important to make sure that they actually get what they need. This may require extensive institutional reform, and that task has to be faced at the very same time when globalization is defended. There's also need for more clarity in formulating the distributional questions that have to be asked. Indeed, I would argue that this issue has been thoroughly messed up by the reputation of half-baked arguments on both sides. It is argued on one side that the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. This is in fact by no means uniformly so, even though there are cases in which this is exactly what's happening. Much depends on what indicators of economic prosperity are chosen, which regions we concentrate on, and the answers that emerge do not speak in one voice. The attempt to base castigation of economic globalization on the thin ice of the hypothesis that the poor are uniformly getting poorer produces a peculiarly fragile critique. On the other side, the apologists of globalization point to their belief, and often the fact, that the poor who participate in trade and exchange are not typically getting poorer. Since they are getting richer through being involved in the global economy, ergo, the argument runs, globalization cannot be unfair to the poor. They too are benefiting. The two sides can then end up in battling over a question that is hard to settle and that is not actually the fundamental issue anyway. It is in fact not adequate to ask whether the poor are getting poorer or richer. Even if the poor were to get just a little richer, this need not imply that the process is moving adequately fast, or that the poor are getting a fair share of the benefits of economic interrelations and of the vast potentials of globalization. Nor is it adequate to ask whether international inequality is getting marginally larger or marginally smaller. The basic concern is the massive level of inequality, not whether it is also getting a little larger or a little smaller at the margin. In fact, it's rather hard to have a clear picture of the trend of the global economic inequality for the reasons which I've just briefly mentioned. Much depends on the period selected and the indicators chosen. The variables in terms of which inequality and poverty are judged makes a big difference. And also, it depends on the groups that are identified, since their fortunes have varied. But the more important point is that this debate about marginal trends does not have to be settled to get on with what is really the central issue, to wit, to recognize and deal with the massive levels of inequality and poverty that exist, indeed characterize the contemporary world. Even if the patrons of the contemporary economic order were right in claiming that the poor in general has moved a little ahead, the compelling need to pay immediate and overwhelming attention to appalling poverty and staggering inequalities in the world would not go away. And to rebel against inequality or protest against unfair sharing of benefits of global cooperation is not necessary to show that this massive inequality or distributional unfairness is also getting marginally a little larger. The central questions have often been rather clouded by over-intense debates on side issues, to which both sides in the dispute seem to have contributed. When there are gains from cooperation, and this is quite central to the argument here, there can be many alternative arrangements that benefit each party compared with no cooperation. So there are different positions that you can go to, each of them beneficial to each party. It is necessary, therefore, to ask whether the distribution of gains is fair or acceptable, and not just whether there exists some gain for all parties, which can be the case for each of these large collection of alternative arrangements. As J.F. Nash, the mathematician and game theorist, discussed more than half a century, well, exactly half a century, well, more than half a century ago, 1950s, a paper published in Econometrica in 1950 called The Bargaining Problem, a paper, by the way, which was cited by the Royal Swedish Academy when he, as a mathematician, got the Nobel Prize in Economics for the relevance of his mathematical work for economics. And one of the two primary contributions was this one we are talking about. He was discussing in the presence of gain from cooperation, the fact that the central issue is not whether a particular arrangement is better for all than no cooperation, since there are many such alternatives, but whether that was a fair division of the benefits. The criticism that the distributional arrangement for cooperation is unfair cannot be rebutted, as it often is, I'm afraid, by the apologists for globalization, and I've seen quite a lot of this expressed in very reputable publications, cannot be rebutted by just noting that all the parties are better off than would be the case in the absence of cooperation. That just simply is not adequate. Let me illustrate it with an example. To argue that a particularly unequal and sexist family arrangement is unfair, it does not have to be shown that women would have done comparatively better had there been no families at all, but only that the sharing of the benefits of the family system is seriously unequal in the particular prevailing arrangement. The issue on whether many of the debates have concentrated, to wit, whether the poor too benefit from the established economic order, is inadequately probing, indeed ultimately the wrong question, in much the same way as the sexist criticism of sexist arrangement in the family would be, by retorting, saying, if it's so unfair, why don't you live outside families? It has to be asked whether the unfairly treated parties, whether women in the family or poor in the globalized world, whether they could have benefited more and could have had a fairer deal. That is what the fuss regarding globalization is about. It's not just about whether the poor are getting poorer or richer. The use of the market economy is in fact consistent with many different ownership patterns, resource availabilities, social opportunities, rules of operation, such as patent laws, antitrust regulations, etc. And depending on which arrangement prevail, we can get very different prices in terms of trade and quite diverse overall outcomes with varying levels of inequality and poverty. There's nothing revolutionary in this statement. Standard elementary economics. The central question is not, indeed cannot be, whether or not to use the market economy. That shallow question is easy to answer, since it is not possible to have a prosperous world without extensive use of markets. But that recognition does not end the discussion. It only initiates it. The market economy can generate many different results, depending on how physical resources are distributed, how human resources are developed, what rules of game prevail, and so on. In each of these spheres, economic, social, and political institutions have roles to play within a country and in the world at large. The market is one institution among many, and its irreducible importance does not make the other institutions insignificant, even in terms of the results that the market itself, economy itself, will produce. The ability of the poor to participate in economic expansion depends on a variety of enabling conditions, many of them social and societal. As has been amply established in empirical studies, these conditions include education, include epidemiology, include land reform, include microcredit facilities, include appropriate legal protection, and many other means and institutional means on which the empowerment of people depend. The success of the market economy depends on what happens to these arrangements. The demands of economic globalization are not confined only to joining the market economy, freeing the trade and exchange, and all that debate concerned with it, but extend very far beyond that. For example, while forces of competition may drive some traditional producers, just to give one example, forces of competition in a globalized world may well drive some traditional producers out of their customary jobs. There's nothing peculiar about that. That's the way technological progress often occurs. The displaced people can, of course, find other jobs if they're able to enter the globalized economy easily and find something else. But the displaced people cannot easily enter into new productions in a globalized world if they happen to be illiterate, unable to read instructions, or suffer from chronic ill health. And there are many other disabling conditions that we can mention here. In that situation, they can get the stick of the global economy without any of the carrot. Economic globalization is not just about markets. I've been arguing in favor of globalization, but also affirming the legitimacy of many of the questions that the anti-globalization protesters raise. There is a misdiagnosis as to where the problem lies. It does not lie in globalization itself, but in inequality and the inadequacy of institutional arrangements that could change the nature and operation and results of the market economy. The terms of the debate on the global market economy have to be, I would argue, thoroughly changed. If people need enabling social and economic and political opportunities, along with the actual power to enter and use the market, that compound recognition cannot be summarized either by claiming that the market needs our support or by claiming that the market has to be opposed. The overall opportunities constitute an interconnected whole of which the market economy is a part, but there is much else. Since global capitalism is much more concerned with expanding the domain of market relations than with these other enabling conditions, say democracy or elementary education or social opportunities, globalization of markets is on its own a very imperfect approach to world prosperity. Indeed, it's much worse than that. As George Soros has pointed out in his book, Open Society, published last year, there's a follow-up which is in the press coming out soon. International business concerns often have a very strong preference for working in orderly and highly organized autocracies rather than in activist and less regimented democracies. And this can be a regressive influence, he argues, on equitable development. Multinational firms can also exert their influence on the priorities of public expenditure in less secure third world countries in the direction of giving preference to those public measures which provide safety and convenience of the managerial classes and of the privileged workers who work in many of these secluded industries over the removal of widespread general illiteracy, medical deprivation, and other adversities of the underdogs of societies. These possibilities do not, of course, impose any insurmountable barrier to development. You can combine these changes along with having a prosperous market economy. They are not insurmountable barrier, but it is important that the surmountable barriers be diagnosed and actually be surmounted. Issues of inequality raise questions about global arrangements and not merely local and national ones. And I should extend what I've been saying into the global arena directly also. The distribution of the benefits in the global economy depends, among other things, on a variety of institutional arrangements in the world, including trade agreements, the nature of the patent laws, the types of medical initiatives that are undertaken and permitted, educational exchanges, facilities for technological dissemination, ecological and environmental restraints, and even fair treatment of accumulated debts, which could be very disabling, often debts incurred by irresponsible military rulers of the past, but inherited today. Military conflicts is another issue, and they're not unrelated to the debt issue either, as I mentioned, but it also is a very important issue on its own. It's a subject on which I would argue a new initiative is badly needed, going beyond the need, and I don't want ambiguity on that, very important need to curb and fight terrorism, on which the focus is largely concentrated right now. We have to go well beyond that. Local wars and military conflicts, which have very destructive consequences, not least in the economic prospects of poor countries, draw not only on regional tensions, as they do, but also on global trade in arms and weapons, indeed the global pushing of arms and weapons. Indeed, it's remarkable that the world leaders who express such deep frustration, often with some justice, at the irresponsibility of anti-globalization protesters, lead the countries that also make the most money in this terrible trade. During 1996 to 2000, the G8 countries, which were meeting in Genoa, these countries together sold 87% of the total supply of arms exported to the entire world. The world establishment is in fact firmly entrenched in this business. The permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, which had a good deal of overlap with G8, were together responsible for 81% of the world arms export. Not hard to see why the Security Council doesn't take many actions on that. The share of the United States alone has just gone up a little from being 48% of the world exports to 50% of the total sales in the world. And furthermore, as much as 68% of American arms exports goes to developing countries. The arms are used not only with bloody results, but also with devastating effects on the economy, on the polity, and on the society. Not only does the world establishment have an important contributory role in the continuation of this terrible state, but we should recollect that even the genesis of political militarism, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in that genesis, these powers played a very big part when the Cold War was fought out over that unhappy continent. During the Cold War decades, when military overlords, Mobutu or Savimbi or whoever, busted social and political arrangements, and ultimately economic order too, in Africa, they could rely on support either from the USA and its allies or from the USSR, depending on their military alliances. And some clever ones, like Somalia, went on shifting from Soviet Union, US, and Soviet Union, US, and did pretty well out of that. The leaders did, that is. I wouldn't even say leaders, because it's not clear that they lead anything. The people in power, people in office, as they say. The world powers bear an awesome responsibility in the subversion of democracy in Africa, with all its far-reaching consequences from which we are still suffering today. And they, and this is where it relates to the earlier discussion, have a continuing role in escalating military conflicts today in Africa and elsewhere by continued pushing of armament. The recent refusal by the United States to agree to a joint crackdown even on illicit sales of small arms, as proposed by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, illustrates the difficulties that are involved. I say recent, that's when I wrote it, but it was prior to September, but it might have been different, because I think it's August we're talking about that. We certainly need a fuller approach to globalization. And in this, the solidarity of a global identity can make a major difference. This is partly because the common problems have to be voiced in an effective way together across the borders of countries. In fact, the voice of the so-called anti-globalization protesters, if appropriately focused, at a big if appropriately focused, can contribute greatly to a more justly globalized world by keeping certain questions in focus. The effectiveness of this dialectical contribution can, of course, be greater if the exact problems and difficulties are more clearly identified and analyzed than they seem to be done by both sides at this time. There is also a very important need for making use of global learning, trying to benefit from what we may call the solidarity of experience. For example, Japan's positive experience in getting very big economic rewards from giving priority to expanding school education not only benefited Japan, but informed and radically influenced the development strategy of many East Asian economies, including South Korea and Taiwan and the others. And their experiences, in turn, have now much to teach other developing countries. The causal understanding generated by the solidarity of experience has functional merit, but it has other merits too. It has an important role in facilitating a fuller appreciation of the prospects of the world in which we live. It has a very important confidence-building role, because if you can see the cause and effect relationship, it is something that is not peculiar to one region, but something which can be multiplied elsewhere across the world. This solidarity of experience helps to resist the premature cultural determinism, and now I'm coming back to some of the themes I discussed yesterday, which can make the world needlessly divisive and the prospects for the future unnecessarily pessimistic. The argument that culture matters, I come back to, I'm afraid, to Samuel Huntington again. This is a later book by Sam Huntington and Lawrence Harrison called Culture Matters, How Values Shape Human Progress. And I'm referring in particular, I'm quoting now, the book is concerned with that, to Huntington's foreword to it, which is not called Culture Matters, it's called Culture Counts. And it is, the argument here is presented, which I'm going to quote, is presented with amazing brevity and remarkable diagnostic simplicity. So I quote from the preface in the book Culture Matters by Sam Huntington. In the early 1990s, I happened to come across economic data on Ghana and South Korea in the early 1960s, and I was astonished to see how similar their economies were then. 30 years later, South Korea had become an industrial giant, with the 14th largest economy in the world, multinational corporations, major exports of automobiles, electronic equipment, and other sophisticated manufactures, and per capita income approximately that of Greece. Moreover, it was on its way to the consolidation of democratic institutions. No such change had occurred in Ghana, whose per capita income was now about 1/15 that of South Korea's. How could this extraordinary difference in development be explained? Undoubtedly, many factors played a role, but it seemed to me that culture had to be a large part of the explanation. South Koreans valued thrift, investment, hard work, education, organization, and discipline. Ghanaians had different values. In short, cultures count, unquote. This fleeting argument, I would argue, does not establish really anything about how important culture itself is, seen in gloomy isolation. There were many things that differentiated South Korea and Ghana already in the 1960s, when they were allegedly described to be similar, including South Korea having an immensely higher literacy rate acquired through massive public education after the Second World War. It's a very high level of illiteracy before the war. It may be tempting to see in these public efforts nothing other than the working out of Korean cultural inclinations, but that would be a hard causal story to sustain, given the fact that South Korea, which had a very high level of illiteracy, like Ghana, had a sharp break in public policy after the Second World War, partly, as mentioned earlier, by explicitly learning from and emulating Japan, and it proceeded to reap as it sowed. There were other institutional differences also between Ghana and South Korea, which again were not just a matter of cultural difference. For example, South Korea's class structure, having a substantial and powerful capitalist class, and a government that wanted to cater to the business community, particularly through an ambitious plan to facilitate Korea's entry into the world of global trade and exchange. It's also worth recollecting that South Korea is still learning other things, not what it learned earlier. And it's learning these things rightly. I mean, rightly, it's right that they are trying to learn that. Sometimes the lessons have come from experiences of failure rather than success. The East Asian crisis from 1997 onwards that overwhelmed South Korea, among other countries in the region, brought out some of the penalties of not having a fully functioning democratic political system. When things moved up and up together, the voice that democracy gives to the underdog may not have been immediately missed in terms of airing of grievances. But when the economic crisis came and divided the fell, as they almost always do in crisis, the newly impoverished missed the voice that democracy would have given them to use for protest and to demand economic redress. Also, the fact that South Korea had no social security system worth the name. Democracy became the predominant issue in the politics of economic crisis, along with the recognition of the need to pay attention to downside risk and to economic security. There was a global lesson here too, to wit the special contribution of democracy in helping the victims of disaster and the need to think not only about growth with equity, the old Korean slogan, but also about downturn with security, because you will have downturns from time to time. And of course, Korea had proceeded to learn this lesson very quickly, with the democracy being the electoral issues on which Kim Dae-jung was elected, and these debates are very active, of course, now. Of course, culture does matter. How can it not? Since culture can influence what we want and how we behave. In the last lecture, I argued that civilization and culture, while important, need not be the principal, not to mention unique identity, in categorizing the people of the world. And in the earlier part of this lecture, I discussed why a culturally fragmented reading of the history of globalization does not actually work. In a similar vein, I would like to end, therefore, this discussion, which I've just finished, by saying that culture need not be the principal determinant of all our achievements and failures, including economic success and deficiency. This is not because culture is unimportant, but we have to see how culture relates to other parts of our integrated life, including social opportunities, economic relations, political freedoms, and so on. The world in which we live is thoroughly interdependent and not discretely fragmented. In the third lecture in this series, I'll go on to culture and identity, and some of the issues I'll be able to discuss a little bit more. And from there, in the fourth lecture, I'll go, as I mentioned, to class, gender, and race. And then in April, to ethics and identity. And in the final lecture, on the future of identity. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me so far.
So, to ask your questions of Dr. Sen, would you please raise your hand? He will, when he recognizes you, wait, and one of the young ladies will come over with a microphone. Then be sure to put it on when you speak and off when you stop. And we'd appreciate it if, when you ask your question, you tell us your name and affiliation.
There's a question here.
Hi, my name is Sunanda Sanyal. I'm an art historian. My question is concerned about the issue of power. I was thinking about your comparison of this global, or not comparison, but your reference to the globalization that happened in the opposite direction from the east to the west around the Middle Ages. What concerns me is that issue of power, that kind of globalization, it was not grounded in power, whereas this globalization that we are witnessing now, which is preceded by colonization, that is solely was primarily based on power. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I would like to comment on it. Three things. First of all, if by power you mean conquest, some of it actually did occur, of course. I mean, the Islamic empire was very large. The Ottomans were strong. The Moors played a major part, and quite a lot of the transition that we are talking about occurred there, in fact. Not often recognized that the black gowns that are worn in my university now, Cambridge and Oxford, which is can't live without it, is in fact imitation of the mullah's clothing spreading from Spain elsewhere. There's a long history of conquest connected with it. Secondly, power is not just conquest, of course, because, as people say, knowledge itself is power. Ability to do things which others don't know how to do is power. So even when it spread without that conquest, it had the feature of power, and in a sense the spread of knowledge is integrally linked with power anyway. I mean, that's That's one respect in which the modern literature on power has made a significant contribution as to what the linkage of knowledge with power is. So I think that's the thing to do. The third thing is to be careful not to regard every post hoc to be propter hoc. The fact that that modern science and technology is spreading in the internet, spreads from America to India, in which it has made a big difference to life for people. The fact that it's occurring also at a time when the Western imperialism had been dominant over the last 200 years, and at a time when the United States is the most powerful party. The fact that these are all happening together does not indicate that that's the only reason why the internet is spreading. But for American imperialism, Indians will not start using the internet. I don't believe it for a second. So that the fact that certain things are accompanied by other things does not in itself indicate that they are causally linked. They may be. In this case, they are not, but they can be in some other cases. So what we need to do is a much more integral analysis. I think what I'm resisting is this idea. We live in a world of Western imperialism, Western science and technology coming from the West, ergo. It is a branch of, an arm of, tentacle of, I think tentacle is a better word than arm, tentacle of Western imperialism. I think that argument is just rubbish, but very extensively used and repeated. That's what I'm resisting. Yeah, there are a lot of hands, okay?
You cited basically an anti-globalization protester sort of argument that globalization makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, and then contrasted it with an argument from a pro-globalization point of view that that globalization makes the rich richer and also the poor a little bit richer. And then I think follow to say that that's in some sense the wrong question, and that the problem is massive inequalities, which I think might be remedied by, well, various foreign aid. But I guess my question is, if you'd say, if we don't have an alternative because it isn't going to be persuasive among Western electorates or whatever, that's going to actually redistribute resources towards the poor and who need them, isn't it still worthwhile to ask the question of if our only alternatives are globalization or preventing globalization, isn't that still a worthwhile
with all
question?
the institutional features that we have today? You see, by the very fact of stating that globalization with all the features that we have today, if it were the case that you were discussing, where everyone is better off, the rich a lot richer, the poor a little bit richer too, compared with that not having it, if these were the only two choices, wouldn't it be better to have it? Well, the answer is fairly obvious. But I think that's extremely counterproductive to think of that, because these institutional arrangements can be radically changed, and they don't require a world revolution to change the patent laws. I mean, for example, in the AIDS vaccine, the battle that the pharmaceutical companies gave to a great extent is lost. It will lose in many other fields, I don't doubt. The issue of armaments that I referred to, I think it's possible to put imposition on that, restrictions on that. And I think this is where pressure and understanding, and I'm afraid one of the celebrations that these lectures do is the celebration of the power of knowledge. I think our understanding that this is what happens. The arms are not only used, but they're also pushed, and the pushing is often done by the richest countries in the world. I think that understanding and determined counteraction based on that could be very powerful. Oddly enough, and I think that's where I've also mentioned that anti-globalization protesters actually may make a major contribution. I don't want to be great proponent of busting up meetings, but you try to get together and you can't meet. You try to meet in another place and you can't meet. Probably can meet in Qatar, the only place where you could meet. But then it becomes a bit difficult at some stage. You have to ask the question, what should we do which makes meetings possible? Well, that's a very positive question, emerging out of a very negative thing. So I think there's all kinds of ways in which the world in which we know can change. And I finished the first lecture yesterday by saying that we have to take responsibility not only for the way we see ourselves, but also for the world in which we live. And that, I'm afraid, applies here too. And to begin where the apologists for globalization as it stands begin, namely, people are getting better off. And this is repeated. I've seen it in the Financial Times, I've seen it in The Economist. It's just not good enough. That's not what the argument is about. And unfortunately, anti-globalization protesters also don't mark the argument. They just take the same thing saying, no, it's not the case. Poor are getting poorer, which is often just not true. So I think there's no case for us to pursue false statements. I mean, there's never a case anyway, but there's not even a strategic merit, tactical merit even in it. Not only are they false, and demonstrably often false, but also that's not the issue at all. And that's really what I wanted to mention. So your answer to your very narrowly defined question is, yes, in that case it would be better. It's exactly like, to take the family analogy, if the choice was that women are in a subservient position, don't go to higher education. If I'm not even taking Afghanistan, I'm taking more advanced countries, do the cooking always and take up jobs if they can, that can be combined in addition to cooking and looking after children. If that were the only possible family arrangement, or no families at all, what would you do? Well, you choose that arrangement. But that doesn't tell you that there isn't something to worry about in family arrangements. It's exactly the same analogy applies here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Reshma. You were commenting a little bit earlier about how the spread of science and technology, is something that can actually benefit the world. I was wondering about issues around cultural imperialism, and you touched upon that a little bit, but, kind of the onset of Coca-Cola and MTV, and a lot of anti-globalization protesters have issues with the way that different types of commercial culture are taking over traditional art, music, and ways of life. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about what you thought regarding that.
Well, I'll come into it. I mean, I think it will be, I will say one or two words on that, but it will figure, as you would expect, in the third lecture, which is on culture and identity. I think cultural imperialism is a complex notion. If you say it's imposed, like British law being imposed in India, or French law being imposed on a French African colony, or Portuguese in Mozambique or Angola, that would be one kind of imperialism. But people don't mean that here. It means that the power is so dominant. I think one has to distinguish between cultural forms which tend to win out in competition, and cultural forms that win out only because the competition is stifled. Now, I think there is a position to take, which I think is a reactionary position, that even if it wins out on a fair competition, you should resist Western music or Western Coca-Cola because that's not ours. I reject that for reasons that I discussed yesterday and that I will continue to discuss throughout the series. I don't see that imposition of cultural identity on others is something that's open to us now. The idea that you can speak on behalf of everyone living in your country is just absurd. People, individuals, should have a choice in this matter. I think what becomes really relevant is to see whether the indigenous art forms and the competition, as it were, are getting adequate opportunity to enter fairly in competition. And there is a lot to be done. And that is not the thing that the anti-cultural imperialists often concentrate on. Very often they're in favor of banning this or banning that. But it's the question of providing more resources for traditional culture form in India, maybe Bharatanatyam or Kathak or South Indian classical music, whether it's getting airing, and to what extent that could be a factor in the world. Now, quite a lot of things that we would associate as frothy Western contribution coming to India is, of course, part of the Indian, quote-unquote, cultural imperialism in the form of Bollywood, which proceeds to cover a lot of the world. I was once, I didn't recognize how powerful they were in Nigeria, for example. I was being driven by a very extremely well-informed Nigerian taxi driver from Logan to home near Harvard Square about 4 years ago, I'd say, before I went back to England. And he was absolutely shocked that I didn't even know the names of the main actors and actresses in India. And he decided to remedy my lack of education and went on telling me that, which was very nice because I learned a great deal. But then as we approached home, since his lecture wasn't finished, he took circuitous routes to be able to complete the lesson he was giving me. And it was very cheap education because that additional taxi fare wasn't much. And I did really learn, as a kind of nutshell, half-an-hour lecture on Indian film from a Nigerian who had just come here at that time, 6 months earlier. It was just amazing. The cultural imperialism is a very complex quantity. If the Bollywood films win out in this competition, despite the frothiness, it's not really, you can describe it as Indian cultural imperialism in Nigeria, but it isn't only that. There's something else also in that story. There is so much of authoritarianism in the resistance to cultural imperialism, which I must say I find very difficult to accept. And it's that one has to look at. And the alternative route of trying to support the possible flourishing of indigenous culture, and if they don't flourish nevertheless, well, then you've had it. It didn't work. That seemed to be very much more worth doing and worth pursuing. Okay. There's a gentleman there. Oh, okay.
Thank you. My name is Pascal. And I just want to follow one point that you made, that the point of contention is inequality. If the main point of contention is inequality in sharing of the gains of globalization, and if there is already massive inequality existing now, even in decision-making power, isn't globalization a done deal, and therefore aren't globalization a lost battle? Moreover, isn't the debate another way of expanding the globalization agenda of inequality?
Yeah, it's right you should ask that question, because if it were a done deal, then what's the point of resisting it? I don't think it is a done deal, and that's what I was mentioning in answer to the question that the gentleman in the third row asked earlier, namely that there are major changes you can actually make. I think this idea that we live in a world where we are powerless is often an illusion. There's a lovely passage of Jean-Paul Sartre where he mentioned that quite often the lack of power that we have, not always actually, it could be very misleading in all cases, but there are many cases where the lack of power relates to our belief that we don't have that power. And it could make a dramatic difference to taking a more constructive agenda. And I'm very keen that anti-globalization protesters remain as active as they are, but take on the more constructive issue, which they can, and which are really close to their cause that they have. But that has to begin by recognizing that it isn't anti-globalization as such. Indeed, the anti-globalization protest in the world today is the most spectacularly globalized event in the world. There's nothing like it in terms of the people protesting in Seattle, etc., are not local boys in Seattle or in Genoa. Most Genoans didn't even know where they came from. Came from everywhere in the world. So it is a very major thing, and I think it could be a very big force for good.
It's on. My name is Lagodinsky. I'm from Kennedy School. You were talking about new global institutional arrangements. Would you comment on the present situation with WTO versus standards, labor standards, social standards, and the resistance of the developing countries to insert these standards and link them to the WTO matters? The same for environmental issues. Would you say that there is a fundamental dreadlock of the existing institutions? And if yes, then would you then plead for a global, for a completely new system of the world trade? Thank you.
Well, to raise issues about labor standards and environmental requirements must be a constructive process. Because if you're living in a situation when there are no label standards and where there's no concern for the environment, you are bound to lose out on many things which you could have avoided if you were concerned with these issues. The problem arises with seeing what the effects of the labor standards are. See, I think one way of thinking about the issue is really there's a big distinction, which I will come to when I come to the fourth lecture, class, gender and race, that there are two kinds of unfairness. One is exclusion, and the other is unfair inclusion. And in the context of recent debates in Europe, the exclusion, particularly in the form of social exclusion, have become very dominant. Whereas the traditional left position have been not exclusion but unfair inclusion. Exploitation, Marxian notion, is not about exclusion. It's indeed the case that the workers are very much included, but included in an unfair way. Now, the reason why exclusion has become an important matter is because if you concentrate only on unfair inclusion, then you tend to lose out the fact that there are people maybe excluded who are not getting the benefit that a fair inclusion might have had. And the danger here is just that. I mean, for example, in this country, in any campus, it's not hard to get people who would come and agitate about the sweated labor conditions, exploitative work conditions in American factories or other factories there. But supposing as a result of that they just moved away, then all those people, of course, are not unfairly included. They're not included at all. But on the other hand, when excluded from that, how would their lives go? What difference will it make? Would it be the case that they end up even worse? Now, that question has to be asked. So in order to take an adequately aggregative view, you have to look at unfair inclusion as well as unfair exclusion. And the real difficulty with the labor standard thing isn't that labor standards are against unfair inclusion. That's what the purpose is. And it's right that that question should be asked. But it has to be contrasted with the cost of unfair exclusion. It's that integrative perspective that we have to look at. So, and that cannot be captured by saying either you're in favor of labor standards or you're against. You're not going to get a slogan which would work irrespective of the exact circumstances that we are dealing with, what type of standard, where it's to be applied. Will it be applied only to foreign companies, also domestic companies, only to big companies, also small ones? Will it apply to home-based, so on, etc.? And these are matters that come in. One of the ways in which the ILO, under the Director General who was appointed 2 years ago, who took office, Somavia, has been trying to do, is to try to include the reach of the labor standards to unorganized industry. But that, of course, immediately also requires you to rethink about labor standards in a much more, in a less formulaic way. So it's a very interesting subject. I cannot give a straightforward answer to it, but the answer will have to take note of the interdependencies involved between unfair inclusion on one side and unfair exclusion on the other. Okay?
Hi, my name is Vikram Kumar. Do you have any ideas by which we could make indigenous industries competitive? Learning from the fact that subsidies and tariffs didn't quite work, especially in infrastructure projects in India and other parts of the world. Is there some quasi-protectionist mechanism that could be used, or any such ideas you have?
I don't think at that level of generality I could answer that question. Many indigenous industries in different parts of the world do work, and work quite well. Many of them don't. And it's a question, I mean, we're now going into a details of a kind that could not be summarized in the form of a kind of capsuled wisdom on that, I'm afraid. But it's good that you should think about this and raise that question, because we have to ask that question. My general feeling is, and here I hate the word feeling in answer to an intellectual question, because one should be thinking rather than feeling about it. But I'm using the word feeling here because I don't know enough to say my feeling would be to expect that, in fact, the role that tariff could play, the barriers could play, has to be very strongly time limited. Even, of course, South Korea did use tariff quite well at one stage, and then gave it up. There was a time-bound program on that. And very often that time-bound program doesn't work. So if tariffs are included, there has to come with kind of absolute limitation when it would disappear. And if the industries haven't done by then, it will have to go. By and large, it's probably not going to be as productive as it looked to people 50 years ago. And in general, the experience has been primarily that the protected industries have tended to wallow in the inefficiency which the protection allowed them to flourish in. And that's generally not the right thing to do, but that does not mean that you have to embrace a free trade position in every issue. It's really a question of being sufficiently alive to the contingent nature of the right policies to be chosen in each case. I think you may have to stand up because there are people just behind your head.
Do you think it is possible to devise principles of global social justice in the same way as, for instance, Rawls was able to develop for justice within a society or a country? Because you mentioned that the important issue is inequality. So you mentioned that it's important for us to have an idea of what is a fair share. So it's not only a matter of poor people, poor countries having more, but of how much more. So I wonder if you have elaborated on a more general theory. Thank you.
You know, actually, on one side, I feel bad that I keep referring to future lectures, but on the other side, I feel very encouraged that I'm on the right line. And that is the subject matter of the 5th lecture called Ethics and Identity. But I'll give you, since you've asked the question, I'll tell you what the line would be. There's a way of thinking about global which is an extension of the national. And the best exposition of that is by the greatest theorist of justice in the contemporary world, namely by John Rawls, in the book called The Law of Peoples. And there you have justice within each nation, and then there is a second exercise of what he called original position between the nation, between the representatives of the nation. And that's one way of thinking about it, and naturally the scope of it would be limited since the whole Rawlsian justice is so institution-dependent. You could not operate anything without the institutional structure, and that becomes why you couldn't have a global structure. On the other hand, if you take a view, and the view that I will try to argue for is a more of an economist view, but speaking as a philosopher in this case, namely Adam Smith, and the view of the impartial spectator is like that device is a way of making things fair and unbiased as an alternative approach to original position, the social contract. There are two approaches, the social contract, the impartial spectator. I try to argue that the impartial spectator view does not have that institutional dependence in the same way, and does not also have the feature of there being one preeminent way of thinking about your identity. If all your global interrelations operate through the relation between nations, as in the Rawlsian structure, then your identity, national identity, becomes dramatic, just as in the Huntington story, the civilizational identity dominates everything. In the Rawlsian picture, the national identity dominates. But if an American feminist goes off to Sudan to do something about the lot of the women there, that's not a relation between the United States as a nation and Somalia as a nation. It's a relation between these two persons. So the multiplicity of identities about which I talked in the first lecture will reappear in a big way in the fifth. And the global justice, and this is roughly the line of answer that I will give you, and if you come to the fifth, you will hear it, it won't break into an alternative one undivided global justice story. It will break into different stories depending on the different identities we have. And that would be a problem if you want a completely ordered situation so that any two alternatives could be described as more just, less just, or equally just. But if you don't take that view, and I've tried to argue in my more professional writings, I think you referred to some of them yesterday, that indeed that's a mistake, that would not bother me. So the Smithian view could be taken rather than a kind of Kant-Rawls view with some benefit to understanding global justice. And it does not require to move from the national to the global as if the globe was one nation. We don't have such an institutional arrangement, but we don't depend on the institutional arrangement for that. And this is not unrelated to the question that was asked about whether it's a done deal, whether we should resist it, because the methods of resistance are very many. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can choose.
I was very struck that neither yesterday or today you mentioned at all the question of freedom of association, which seems to be a human right that has been taken away from white people in the contemporary world through the so-called civil rights movement, through the imposition of mass immigration, through the ethnic cleansing of white people from their neighborhoods, the denigration of our civilization, of our culture. This is one of the most fundamental human rights. If these kinds of mass immigration and multiculturalist agenda was being imposed on other countries, I think non-white people would have a very different view of it than they seem to in Western countries. They would regard it as a great injustice. Well, why is it that you didn't even see fit to mention the whole question of freedom of association?
Well,
and also one other. It seems to me that you are in general a representative, an embodiment of a particular kind of sensibility, a kind of cosmopolitan, secularist, internationalist kind of sensibility, and you are yourself constitute a kind of culture. You are trying to impose a global hegemony of the kind of society and the kind of sensibility that you would like to see the whole world embrace, so that you are really simply one more element, one component of the clash of civilizations yourself.
Yeah, okay. Can I answer those questions? Maybe you have to return your microphone. The reason why I wasn't discussing associative rights, which is a very important human right, I agree, is because these are not lectures on human rights. I have written on human rights, and I have talked about associative freedoms. If you look at my book, Development is Freedom, it's very much concerned, among other things, with that issue. I'm talking about identity, and I talked about the idea of identity. Today I'm talking about globalization. And in that context, the movement of people, the movement of ideas, being the freedom to be able to associate with each other, not to be bothered by not to have authoritarian imposition on grounds of resisting cultural imperialism, a question that came up. Associative questions came up indirectly all the time in these. You have a particular thing in mind. You feel that the white people in this country are being badly treated because of the imposition of the multicultural agenda, and that's a battle you will have to take up and pursue it in the way you think fit. As far as the second question is concerned, namely my representing a culture, I certainly do have views. I'm not the issue that was being discussed is not whether that view would dominate, but the need for people having the freedom to choose between different points of view, including that. You might perhaps, after considering the options, decide that the view that makes you look beyond the nation or beyond even the race is a mistake. And if so, if that's the way you come out on the basis of looking at all the options, well, then one would have the satisfaction that you have derived it on the basis of comparing the alternatives with adequate knowledge of it. So to demand that people should be free to compare them, one of the issues I discussed yesterday, for example, was what I believe to be the limitation of faith-based schools, because they don't give you an opportunity to know about other faiths, to compare them. That makes a big difference. And it's to say that you should have freedom to know about and reason about and choose between these alternatives is not an imposition of a particular point of view. I think that's a misdiagnosis, what you made.
Hi, my name is Ajax Mercedes from Kennedy School of Government. I will start by saying that I am the first person from this side, the left side of the auditorium, that has received the opportunity to talk. I hope it's not an ideological bias.
I think spatial justice is a very important one in a whole.
That's the importance of structural situations. One of the classical quotes of your works is the one that states that no famine has ever occurred in democratic countries, regardless of how poor the country may be. Today, you said that democracy plays an important role in protecting the quality of life of poor communities in the case of economic crisis, of economic adjustments.
Yeah, they're related points.
I know. The thing is that both points imply a very important role of political arrangements in economic performance. My question is, if both cases are kind of defensive against, in one case, famine, in other, structural adjustment, is also the case of this importance in proactive economic performance, example, acquiring certain levels of development, sustaining growth during the a long period of time. Is democracy an important asset in economic development? There are people that say that, for example, authoritarian regimes as Pinochet in Chile or South Korea played an important role in obtaining levels of economic growth. My question is democracy an important element in economic development?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but I have a whole chapter on that in Development as Freedom. But I will give you, briefly what I think on that. The democracies, point one, democracies are quintessentially good and almost uniquely powerful in protecting severely deprived people, because the deprivation of the severely deprived is easy to make vivid if the media is free, very easy to be brought into the public arena for discussion, and therefore famine prevention is a very good example, very easy example of democracies. You give a picture, you print a picture of a emaciated mother and a skin and bone child on her lap, you have written an editorial. You don't even have to do anything. And electorally, it could be a big thing, as I tried to argue also in my presidential address to the American Economic Association, published in AER, called Rationality and Social Choice, I think, in 1995, I believe, that it does not depend on whether the deprived are themselves a small minority, because even a small minority could be very effective in a majority, because the way the majoritarian concerns cannot ignore the fact, and that's where identity, of course, does come into the story, that in some ways, but for the grace of God, there go I, is a thought that democracy can very strongly inspire. So that's the first point. That doesn't tell you about those things which are not so big and not so immediately vivid. Like in India, persistent undernourishment, endemic undernourishment could survive even though famine doesn't. India's record on nutrition is pretty bad, even though its record on famine prevention is very good. So that's the second point to make, that it depends on how complex it is. But connected with that, the third point is that it's really not independent. We come back to some of the issues as to what we do. That is, things could become politicized by our effort. I mean, one of the issues is gender, for example, in India, has become politicized in a way would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. When I first started writing on gender in 1970, about that time, it was very difficult to make people even interested in the subject. There were people who were full of sympathy for the underdog, but that took the form of class as opposed to gender. But gender has become a big issue now. To think that the parliament is now debating whether 1/3 of the seats could be reserved in parliament for women, and the feminist position itself changes. One of the leaders of the feminist group, the Manushri group, argues that would be quite a mistake. Rather, it has to be done the way, to some extent, the English political system operates, namely each party has to have a certain proportion of women in seats rather than reserving some seats for women. The fact that we are in the ways and means of that debate, and already in the local government, it has already been done, that it's been carried out by many of the states on the basis of a combined resolution that 1/3 of the local self-government leaders must be women. Now, that would have been unthinkable, really, 30 years ago, I think. So things could become, and I hope that undernourishment will become also a major issue. Democracy gives us the opportunity to do that, which, of course, an authoritarian system does not. So to a great extent, it's a potential, and it depends much on how much we seize. And we can't really just give it up to democracy as if it's an agent. Democracy isn't an agent. It allows agencies of a kind which we have to still seize and do. Now, on the statistical thing that you mentioned, which are very often quoted, we haven't got any kind of confirmation of the casual empiricism that even, forget development, even economic growth tends to be highly correlated positively with authoritarian rule. Easy enough to argue if you take Singapore vis-a-vis India, but not very hard to go the other way if you take Afghanistan or North Korea as the authoritarian country, or look at Botswana in Africa as the fastest growing economy for a long time, fastest growing in the world for many years, which is a oasis of democracy in Africa. Basically, the two main studies that I know of, namely by Robert Barrow and by Przewalski and Limousin, end up with orthogonality. They are not closely related as far as economic growth is concerned. But the development argument also includes security, the protection of the vulnerable, and the opportunity to raise inequality issues, which won't be captured in economic growth, but which nevertheless will have that feature. So I think that's the perspective in which one has to see the promise of democracy, what it can do. And its opportunities and promise is a great deal more than what had been realized. What has been realized is not negligible. That sentence which you quoted is, I have to say, one of my least favorite, actually it's my second least favorite statement. The other one is about the, actually the third, I think. My least favorite statement is some comparison with Mother Teresa, which I find absolutely demeaning to one of the greatest human beings, namely Mother Teresa, to describe my economics to have something to do with it, and it's somewhat demeaning of my economics too, because you know, it's all this hard work. You stay up late at night and work on it, and then it says, no, it's all goodness. It's really quite annoying. And similarly, also the question of my being conscious of the profession worries me deeply. But the third is the statement that famines don't occur in democracies. I did say that 25 years ago, and it was true, and it's still true. But it's not a very interesting statement, actually, and it's kind of obvious. And the really interesting issues about democracy lie well beyond that. Namely, what can you, your question, what can you make of undernourishment, gender inequality, racial divides, and other kind of social caste divides, for example. And there the issues about democracy are very important. Yeah, I think there's spatial justice happening now.
I guess the question I think we're trying to, in these lectures, think about the future, and I think that's what you're trying to do with Faras. My question has to do with when we think about globalization and its impact and its need in many ways for economies or countries, depending on how you want to define it, to compete with each other on an equal footing, and cultures being or maybe may need to be defined. How to define culture, may not just music or something like that, but rather education, health, legal, and some of the really serious issues associated with a culture, really how it can compete globally. So when we think about the problem in terms of the evolution of the global economy, doesn't it indicate that in some sense there will have to be some kind of sort of almost, I don't want to use homogeneous, but sort of relatively similar type of underlying structures that will allow countries to compete equally or effectively?
Compete in the cultural sphere.
And no, not fear, no, but just simply that if they don't have good educational systems, that if they don't have reasonably good legal systems, medical systems, and things like that, to allow the individuals in their country to really be able to be productive, So that won't most of these cultures then, except for maybe music and the literature and so on, most of these cultures be in some fundamental sense maybe economically similar? Isn't that where we're going?
Well, there will be some similarity, but there are a lot of similarities. We don't grumble. We don't say, look at the loss of variety. All children are vaccinated these days. We don't see it because we don't see it as a loss of a basic diversity, which is important to preserve, some vaccinated and others not vaccinated. And similarly, some educated, others not educated, some having the medical opportunities, others not having it. Those diversities we don't seem to value, and I think it's not just the case we don't seem to, there is a reason why we don't. On the other hand, there are other kinds of diversities, and I think your question would become very relevant to that if it were turned out that the world of the use of education, the use of freedom to have music or painting led to people doing similar kind of painting and similar kind of music. I don't see any evidence of that happening anywhere in the world. So I would expect that there will be a lot more uniformity in the world, and much of it would be, in my judgment, rightly so, because the lack of uniformity would have some bearing similar to the diversity of vaccinated children and non-vaccinated children. But the other question, and I don't know a definitive answer to that, as to whether it would also, and the question that the lady asked on that side about Coca-Cola, might indicate that there is a tendency for some of these to win out so that the world may end up being similar, not just in this respect, but even in the type of drink that you have. I don't have to say that in some of these, I don't actually have any antecedent view as to whether I'd like to live in a world where everyone drinks rather similar drinks, or in a world where they all drink extremely different ones. I'm not sure that I have any a priori view on that. I do have an a priori view in which either forcing Coca-Cola on people by busting up competition or keeping drinks like Coca-Cola out on grounds that this is foreign import, I do have a view that that's not the kind of society I'd like. On the other hand, substantively, how much variety, what kind of diversity I want, I don't know. So you're asking a question of profound complexity, and I'm not able to answer it, and I can't even promise that I will answer it in my third lecture on culture and identity. Thank you.